In 1974, the Chancellor of West Germany resigned. Not because he lost an election, not because he was caught in a scandal, because the man who carried his briefing folders, managed his schedule, and sat beside him in closed meetings had been reporting everything to East Germany for 17 years. He wasn't a spy from a movie. No gadgets, no gunfights. He was a quiet, reliable assistant. The kind of person no one thinks to question. This isn't a story about espionage. It's a story about trust. How it's built, slowly, through small, ordinary acts. And how the same mechanism that builds it can be used to destroy everything. It took 17 years. And it started here.
There is a photograph taken sometime in the early 1970s that most people have never seen. In it, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and unremarkable features stands just behind Willy Brandt, the Chancellor of West Germany, at what appears to be a campaign event. The man is smiling. Not the wide, practiced smile of a politician, but the quiet, satisfied smile of someone who knows exactly where he is and exactly why he is there. His name is Günter Guillaume. And at the moment that photograph was taken, he had been reporting everything he saw, everything he heard, and everything he read to the intelligence services of East Germany for more than a decade. This is not a story about a brilliant spy. It is not a story about gadgets or code-breaking or the kind of espionage that fills thriller novels. It is a story about something far more ordinary and far more unsettling. It is a story about how a man with average intelligence, a modest personality, and a talent for making himself indispensable can walk into the center of a government and remain there, undetected, for 17 years. It is a story about trust, what it looks like, how it is built, and how quietly it can be destroyed. But it is also, and perhaps more deeply, a story about Willy Brandt. Because to understand why Guillaume's exposure mattered so much, you have to understand what Brandt represented. And to understand what Brandt represented, you have to understand the particular moment in German history in which he rose to power. West Germany in the late 1960s was a country still negotiating with its own reflection. The Federal Republic had been built on the ruins of the Third Reich, and for 20 years it had pursued a policy of studied amnesia towards the East. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, was not officially recognized by Bonn. It was referred to, with careful bureaucratic distance, simply as the so-called GDR. The border between the two Germanys was treated in official rhetoric as a temporary wound, not a permanent scar. The wall that went up in 1961 was called by West German politicians an act of aggression. And then, after the speeches were finished, everyone went home. Willy Brandt was the man who decided that this approach was no longer honest. He was a social democrat, a former mayor of West Berlin, a man who had watched from his city as the wall was constructed, who had seen the faces of families separated overnight by concrete and wire. He did not believe that pretending East Germany did not exist was a form of resistance. He believed it was a form of cowardice dressed up as principle. When Brandt became Chancellor in 1969, he introduced what came to be known as Ostpolitik, the Eastern policy. The idea was simple in principle and radical in practice. Engage with the East, sign treaties, normalize relations, reduce tension, and in doing so, create small openings through which ordinary Germans on both sides might eventually breathe a little more freely. Travel agreements, cultural exchanges, recognition. The West German right despised him for it. They called it capitulation. They called it collaboration with the enemy. But Brandt understood something his critics did not, or would not admit. that the most effective form of pressure is not isolation, but contact. That the Berlin Wall was a symbol not of East German strength, but of East German fear, and that the way to weaken fear was not to shout at it from across the border, but to slowly, carefully, make it unnecessary. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for this work in 1971, and he was, by almost any measure, one of the most consequential political figures in post-war Europe. He was also the man Günter Guillaume had been ordered to get close to. Günter Guillaume was born in Berlin in 1927. He grew up in Nazi Germany, served in the final years of the war, and emerged from it, like millions of his generation, into a landscape of rubble and reckoning. What path led him to the East German security services is a question that has been examined many times, and the answer is, in the end, less dramatic than one might hope. He believed. He was a true believer in what the GDR represented, in the socialist project, in the Marxist-Leninist vision of a Germany rebuilt on different foundations. Whether that belief was naive or calculated, or simply the faith of a young man looking for something solid to hold on to in a country that had just destroyed itself, is difficult to say from a distance of decades. What is clear is that by the early 1950s, Guillaume had been recruited by the Stasi, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, East Germany's Ministry for State Security. And the mission assigned to him was patient, methodical, and specific. He was to go west. In 1956, Günter Guillaume and his wife Christel crossed into West Germany. They presented themselves as refugees fleeing the East. They brought with them a carefully constructed story. A couple escaping communism, looking for a better life in the Federal Republic. The West German authorities processed them, as they processed thousands of such arrivals, and found nothing to question. Guillaume settled in Frankfurt. He found work. He joined the Social Democratic Party. He made himself useful. This is the part of the story that deserves to be paused over, because what Guillaume did for the next decade and a half was not spectacular. It was not the stuff of cinematic tension. He attended local party meetings, he volunteered, he organized, he made friends slowly in the way that patient people make friends, by showing up, by being reliable, by never asking for too much. He was, by all accounts, moderately competent and extraordinarily consistent. In a political organization, consistency is more valuable than brilliance. Brilliance attracts attention. Consistency builds trust. By the mid-1960s, Guillaume had risen through the Frankfurt SPD to a point where he was beginning to attract notice from the party's national organization. He was a good administrator. He understood logistics. He was the kind of man who made sure the details were handled, who remembered the names of people's spouses, who sent letters when letters were expected. The political machine ran on people like him, and the machine rewarded them accordingly. Through the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, as Brandt's star rose and the SPD moved toward national power, Guillaume moved with it. He joined Brandt's campaign team. He proved himself competent and loyal, and when Brandt won the chancellorship and began assembling his personal staff, Guillaume's name was on a list. There was, at this point, a warning. West German counterintelligence, the BFV, the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, had received intelligence suggesting that Guillaume might be an East German agent. The information was not conclusive. It was a signal, not a proof. And the decision was made, fatally, not to act on it immediately, but to watch, to monitor, to wait for something definitive before moving. The logic of this decision is not difficult to follow. Accusing a senior aide to the federal chancellor of being a spy is not a minor matter. If the accusation is wrong, the political and legal consequences are severe. And so the investigators watched, and Guillaume attended meetings, and weeks became months, and months became years. Inside Brandt's chancellery, Guillaume's role was administrative rather than strategic. He was not a policy advisor. He was not a man who shaped decisions. He was a man who knew the schedule, handled the correspondence, managed the logistics of a head of government's working day, which meant, in practice, that he saw almost everything. Consider for a moment what that access actually means. A personal aide to a head of government does not need to attend the meetings where the most sensitive decisions are made. He needs only to carry the briefing papers to and from those meetings. He needs only to see the names on the envelopes. He needs only to hear the conversations that happen in the hallway before the door to the conference room closes. He books the travel. He knows which foreign leader is calling and roughly what about. He sees the fatigue on the Chancellor's face after a difficult session, and he knows, from that alone, that something has gone wrong. Intelligence is not always a document stolen from a safe. Sometimes it is an accumulation of small details, of patterns and schedules and moods that tells an adversary more about the state of a government than any single classified cable. Guillaume was a machine for harvesting this kind of intelligence, and he was harvesting it for the Stasi, for the HVA, the foreign intelligence arm of East German security, and ultimately for the Soviet intelligence services, to whom the Stasi reported. The mechanics of how he transmitted information were, like his cover, deliberately unremarkable. Coded radio messages, dead drops, the apparatus of Cold War espionage that by the 1970s had been refined to a degree of routine efficiency. Guillaume would pass material to his handlers, and his handlers would pass it east, and somewhere in East Berlin and somewhere in Moscow, analysts would read what the West German Chancellor's office was thinking. Among the intelligence Guillaume is believed to have transmitted was material related to NATO communications, to Brandt's personal correspondence with foreign leaders, and to the political calculations being made inside the SPD. Some of this material was of significant strategic value. Some of it was simply detail, the raw material from which a picture of West German decision-making could be assembled. There was also, it later emerged, something more intimate. Guillaume had access to aspects of Brandt's private life that went beyond the professional. Brandt was known within political circles to have a complicated personal life, and Guillaume, as a trusted aide, was sometimes present in situations that were not intended for the record. Whether the Stasi used this information or held it in reserve is a question that has never been definitively answered. But the fact that they had it was not accidental. The collection of personal vulnerabilities was standard Stasi practice. A man's secrets in their hands were not merely information. They were leverage. The investigation that would eventually bring Guillaume down began in earnest in 1973, when the BFE received what it considered sufficiently concrete information to justify a more active surveillance operation. Guillaume was observed. His movements were tracked, his communications were monitored, and slowly, carefully, the investigators began to build a case. But slowly is the right word. The operation moved with the caution of people who understood the stakes and were afraid of the consequences. Inside the BFV, there were debates about how certain the evidence needed to be before the Chancellor's office could be informed. Inside the Chancellor's office, when a warning was eventually passed upward, there were debates about how to handle the information without creating a political crisis before the evidence was airtight. In the meantime, Guillaume continued his work. He accompanied Brandt on foreign trips. He handled correspondence. He attended meetings. He was, to all outward appearances, exactly what he had always been: a reliable, moderately senior aide to a busy head of government. The arrest came in April 1974. Guillaume and his wife Christel were taken into custody in the early morning. When the officers arrived at his apartment, Guillaume, according to those who were present, did not deny what he was. He announced it. He stated with a clarity that left no room for interpretation that he was an officer of the East German military. He offered nothing else. He simply confirmed what they had come to confirm, and then he said nothing more. That moment, that brief declarative sentence in a West German apartment in the early hours of an April morning, set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the Federal Republic's political landscape within weeks. The political fallout from Guillaume's arrest was not immediate, but it was, once it came, nearly total. The question was not simply whether a spy had penetrated the Chancellor's office. The question was what it meant that this had been allowed to happen. The BFV had been warned years earlier. The investigation had proceeded at a pace that allowed Guillaume to remain in place for months after suspicion had hardened into near certainty. The Chancellor himself had not been told in time to act, and now the most sensitive office in the Federal Republic had been compromised, and the extent of the compromise was not yet clear. Willy Brandt resigned on May 6, 1974. The formal reason given in his resignation statement was the Guillaume affair, the failure of security, the questions about what had been passed to the East, the impossibility of leading a government whose most sensitive functions had been penetrated. But those who were close to him in that period have said that the resignation was also something more personal than political accountability. Brandt was, by the spring of 1974, a man who had been carrying significant weight for years. The Nobel Prize had brought recognition, but Ostpolitik had also brought sustained attack from the right, from within his own party, from the Americans who were not entirely convinced that engagement with the East served Western interests. His personal life had been a source of ongoing stress. And now this, the discovery that the world he had spent his career trying to open dialogue with had placed a man inside his inner circle, not to engage, but to observe, not to build trust, but to exploit it. The bitter irony at the heart of this story is not subtle, but it is genuine. Brandt's entire political philosophy rested on the idea that communication across ideological borders was possible, that people on both sides of the divide were, at some fundamental level, reachable, that the wall was a symptom, not a conclusion. And the East German response to this philosophy had been to send a man to sit beside him and report everything he said, and read, and did to the people he was trying to reach. The man who believed in opening the East had been watched by the East all along. After Brandt's resignation, Helmut Schmidt took the chancellorship, and the Federal Republic continued. Guillaume was tried, convicted of espionage and treason, and sentenced to 13 years in prison. Christel Guillaume received a lesser sentence. In 1981, both were exchanged for Western agents held by East Germany, a routine transaction of the kind that occurred periodically throughout the Cold War. Bodies traded across the border like commodities, each side pretending that the human beings involved were chips in a negotiation. Guillaume returned to East Germany and was received as a hero. He received medals. He was given a comfortable apartment. He wrote a memoir, with the considerable assistance of the Stasi's public affairs apparatus, in which he described his years in the West with the careful pride of someone who had done exactly what he was asked to do and had done it well. He died in 1995 in a reunified Germany, a man who had outlived the state he had served and who remained, to the end, unrepentant. The investigators who had moved too slowly faced their own reckoning. Questions were asked in the Bundestag. Careers were ended or diminished. The internal culture of West German counterintelligence was examined with the particular unpleasantness of an organization forced to study its own failures. The conclusions were familiar. Communication between agencies had been insufficient. The political sensitivity of the case had created hesitation where speed was required. The watch had been maintained when an arrest should have been made. These conclusions, careful and institutional as they were, did not explain the loss of Willy Brandt. They did not account for what his departure from office cost the Federal Republic. Ostpolitik survived him. His successor Schmidt maintained its basic architecture, and Brandt himself remained influential within the SPD. But the particular energy, the particular moral authority that Brandt had brought to the project of German reconciliation was not something that could simply be transferred to the next man in the chair. Authority of that kind belongs to the person, not the position. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and when reunification created the conditions for a serious examination of East German state archives, the Stasi files opened a window onto the Guillaume operation that had not previously existed. What emerged was a picture that confirmed what had been suspected in some quarters for years and denied in others. The operation had been more extensive and more carefully managed than the official account suggested. The files revealed the full scope of what Guillaume had passed east. They revealed the networks of support that had maintained his cover. They revealed the careful management of his handlers, who had communicated with him through systems that had largely evaded West German detection. And they raised, again, the question that had been circulating in intelligence and historical circles since 1974. Had Guillaume's exposure been deliberate? The theory runs as follows. By early 1974, Brandt's political position was complicated. He faced challenges from within the SPD, tensions in his relationship with the Americans, and the accumulated fatigue of a man who had been fighting on multiple fronts for years. From the perspective of hardliners in East Berlin and in Moscow, Brandt's Ostpolitik, whatever its tactical uses, represented a long-term threat. The policy of engagement, if it succeeded, would gradually normalize the GDR into a position of recognized legitimacy, but it would also open East German society to the slow, corrosive influence of contact with the West. Every visa issued, every family reunion permitted, every cultural exchange agreed to, was a small crack in the wall's logic. The calculation, in this reading, was that a Brandt who remained in power for another 4 years was more dangerous to the East German state than a Brandt who fell. That allowing Guillaume to be exposed, or engineering the conditions for his exposure, would remove the federal chancellor most committed to the policies the GDR ostensibly wanted, and replace him with a more conventional, less ideologically motivated successor. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but not negligible. The Stasi files show that there were discussions within the HVA about the Guillaume operation in the period before the arrest. They show an awareness that the operation was at risk of detection. They show decisions being made about what to do in that circumstance. What they do not show, or what has not been found in what has been released, is an explicit order to allow exposure. The question remains open. What the files do show, clearly and without ambiguity, is that the operation was run with a level of sophistication that had not been entirely apparent from the outside. Guillaume was not operating alone. He was not a rogue asset improvising as he went. He was a managed instrument of a state intelligence apparatus that had invested years in his placement and had made careful decisions at every stage about how to use what he provided and how to protect him as he provided it. The question of whether that apparatus eventually decided to sacrifice him, to burn a valuable asset in exchange for a more valuable political outcome, is the question that the files raise without resolving. And it is, in some ways, the most telling aspect of the entire story. Because if the answer is yes, then the Guillaume affair is not simply a story about a spy who penetrated a government. It is a story about a government that was maneuvered into destroying itself. And the man at the center of it, the man who signed papers and booked travel and carried briefing folders through the corridors of power, was not just a spy. He was a weapon, aimed with patience and precision at the exact person most capable of changing the world he had been sent to watch. Willy Brandt lived until 1992. In the years after his resignation, he remained active in international politics, serving as the head of the Socialist International and leading what became known as the Brandt Commission, which produced a landmark report on global economic inequality. He did not disappear from history, but the particular moment he had represented, the post-war German politician who had the moral credibility, the personal courage, and the political skill to open the door to the East, that moment did not come again. He had stood in Warsaw in December 1970 and, at the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, knelt without announcement or preparation. The gesture was unrehearsed, and it astonished the world. Here was the Chancellor of the country that had built the camps, kneeling in silence before the monument to those who had resisted. He said afterward that he did it because he felt the weight of history in that place and did not know what else to do. The image traveled around the world, and it said something that no speech, no treaty, no diplomatic communique could say in the same way. That was the man Guillaume had been watching. That was the man whose schedule he had managed, whose correspondence he had handled, whose private moments he had been present for. And whatever Guillaume believed about ideology, about the socialist mission, about his duty to the state that had sent him, whatever framework he used to make sense of what he was doing, he had spent 17 years in the company of a man whose moral weight he could not possibly have failed to notice. There is no record of Guillaume expressing any doubt about what he was doing. There is no letter, no diary entry, no account from anyone who knew him suggesting that he ever paused to consider the contradiction at the center of his work. He had been sent to undermine a man who was trying to bridge the divide that Guillaume himself had crossed. He had been sent to watch a man who believed in reconciliation and to ensure that the state that feared reconciliation most was always one step ahead. The files that came out of East German archives after reunification included Guillaume's operational reports, his assessments of Brandt's state of mind and political vulnerabilities, his accounts of conversations and meetings. Reading them, historians have described a kind of detached professionalism, a man doing a job, cataloguing what he saw, passing it on. There is very little in those reports that suggests anything other than a competent intelligence officer performing his function, which is perhaps the most disturbing thing about them, because the function he was performing was not abstract. It had a face, and a name, and a history, and a moment of kneeling in the Polish snow that meant something to people all over the world. The intelligence Guillaume gathered was gathered from a specific human being, in a specific historical moment, in a Germany still reckoning with what it had done, and trying, through the particular instrument of Willy Brandt, to do something different, The lesson that counterintelligence professionals drew from the Guillaume case was largely technical. Better vetting, faster response to early warnings, improved communication between agencies, stricter compartmentalization around heads of government. These lessons are real, and they were applied, and they have shaped how democratic governments manage personnel security in ways that continue to this day. But the deeper lesson, the one that sits beneath the technical failures, is less comfortable and less tractable. It is the lesson about what trust actually is and how it functions inside power. Guillaume was trusted because he was useful. He was useful because he was consistent. He was consistent because he had been trained to be consistent. Because his entire mission depended on never giving anyone a reason to look at him too closely. He was trusted, in other words, not because anyone had looked deeply at him and made a judgment about who he was. He was trusted because he made it easy to trust him, because he did the small things well and never caused problems, because in the daily flow of a busy government office, someone who handles the details competently and without complaint becomes, over time, almost invisible. This is how the most damaging intelligence operations work, not through brilliance or daring, through patience and ordinariness, through the slow accumulation of normalcy, through becoming the kind of person that no one thinks to question, because questioning them would feel, after a while, almost rude. The intelligence that was lost in the Guillaume case, whatever its full extent, was significant. The intelligence that might have been lost if the operation had continued longer, or if Guillaume had been positioned differently, was potentially far greater. But the thing that was lost beyond recovery, the thing that could not be catalogued in any damage assessment or quantified in any intelligence review, was something more fundamental. It was the particular political moment that Willy Brandt represented. It was the possibility, already fragile, of a kind of leadership that combined moral authority with political power in a post-war Germany still finding its way. That moment was not destroyed by Guillaume alone. It was already under pressure, already complicated by the weight of office and the opposition of interests that Brandt could not fully control. But the Guillaume affair gave that moment a wound it could not survive, and the man who had knelt in Warsaw, who had dedicated his political life to the idea that the divide between East and West was not permanent, resigned from office because of a man who had spent 17 years proving that the East did not share his belief. There is, in the end, something almost classical about this story. The thing that brought Brandt down was not his enemies, not the conservative opposition, not the American skeptics, not the old guard within his own party. It was the very world he had been trying to reach. The world he believed in reconciliation with had sent an emissary to his side, not to reciprocate his faith, but to exploit it. The man who built his career on the possibility of trust was undone by the precise mechanism through which trust operates, the small, daily, unremarkable acts of proximity and reliability through which one person becomes indispensable to another. Guillaume never explained himself beyond the declaration at the moment of his arrest. He never offered a reckoning, a doubt, a moment of reflection that might have made his story something other than what it was. He served his sentence, returned to his country, received his medals, and died. The Stasi that had trained him and managed him, and ultimately, perhaps, sacrificed him, was gone by then, swallowed by the reunification it had worked so hard to prevent. The files it had kept on millions of East German citizens, on hundreds of Western targets, on operations spanning decades, sat in archives where historians and former subjects could read them and try to make sense of what they contained. The photograph from the early 1970s, the one with Guillaume standing just behind Brandt at the campaign event, is not famous. It does not appear in most histories of the period. It is simply a record of a moment, an ordinary political moment in the Federal Republic, a chancellor and his aide standing together in the particular way that powerful men and their assistants always stand. The principal in the foreground, the aide slightly behind, slightly to the side, present but not prominent. Guillaume is smiling. And if you look at that smile knowing what you now know, it is tempting to read something into it: calculation, satisfaction, the quiet pleasure of a man who knows a secret. But the truth is probably simpler and more unsettling than that. It is probably just the smile of a man who had been doing his job for a long time and had become, through patience and consistency and the slow alchemy of daily proximity, someone that no one looked at twice. That, in the end, is the story. Not a story about brilliance or daring or the glamour of espionage. A story about what happens when a government stops looking. A story about what trust costs when it is given too easily and checked too late. A story about a man who knelt in Warsaw and meant it, and another man who watched him and reported it east, and the 17 years of silence between those two facts that neither country fully saw until it was already over.